Welcome to the Health Catalyst podcast, brought to you by YPO. Here we talk about the business of health innovation, and I sit down with industry leaders who have been in the trenches. My goal is to share the lessons and provide practical and actionable advice to help you launch, grow, and scale your business. Today, my guest is Dr. Chen. Jeff is a physician and the co-founder of Radical Science. And in today's episode, we'll explore the role of clinical studies and clinical validation in the wellness sector. I am your host, Rodrigo Hutt. Jeff, thank you so much for being here today and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Rodrigo. Excited to be here.
I am super excited and looking forward to this episode. And before we jump in and start talking about Radical Science, I am very interested in learning more about you and learning about your life as a physician and a researcher. So to get started, I have two questions for you. The first one is, how was life as a physician and a researcher? And the second question, more importantly, is what inspired you to transition to becoming an entrepreneur?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the first thing probably that makes sense is my experience of being an actual physician was primarily just limited to medical school. And in that, I didn't pursue any training or residency or specialization beyond that. And the most rewarding parts of being a physician, in my mind, were just the kind of one-on-one connections you get to make with your patients. You feel like you're making a difference in their lives. You feel like you're meeting and connecting with people that you otherwise wouldn't get an opportunity to. So from a humanistic standpoint, from an emotional standpoint, from a almost like a spiritual connection standpoint, those were some of the most rewarding aspects of that. Some of the areas that, even though I got a brief glimpse into my limited time, actually as a practitioner or as a medical student, was that the healthcare systems are in some ways kind of the opposite of that. I felt like a cog in a wheel, and it was these kind of bureaucratic healthcare systems that were kind of pushing this train along, even though all the people that on the train were like, wait, why is this train headed in this direction? How do we change the course of it? And sometimes it felt pretty disempowering in that regard. Now, it was because of that experience that I got much more interested in ways to deliver health that did not involve the traditional healthcare system, which has a lot of competing interests. Pharma companies want one thing, and the insurance providers want another, and then the healthcare providers want to just do right by their patients, and the patients are kind of confused by it all, and they're being bombarded by direct-to-consumer pharma advertising, in which America is one of a few countries in the world that allows that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have a single payer system. So as I looked around, I said, man, yeah, I could spend my whole career trying to improve the healthcare system. That's why I got my MBA while I was in medical school at UCLA. And I said, or maybe there's better ways to deliver health that in complete independence of the healthcare system. And that's where the whole world of wellness and botanicals and alternative medicine and integrative medicine and lifestyle and diet, all these things came into focus. And, we don't learn much about that in medical school. And there's also not a ton of research into these areas because you don't have massive companies patenting, monopolizing these different modalities and then investing, tens, hundreds of millions of dollars into research to prove what these things do. And so what I recognized was, with more proof and validation behind these non-pharmaceutical, unpatentable health interventions, that maybe it was a way for people to arrive at better health on their own without having to go deal with a healthcare system, prescriptions, insurance, all these things. And so that's when I decided to become a scientist. And I started after I graduated from medical school and business school, I started a research center at UCLA. And I thought that's how I was going to create my impact. And the process of scientific discovery is exciting. And I think that, on a micro level, I think we're all scientists because we're constantly coming up with a hypothesis and hopefully testing it and being willing to admit when we're wrong for that. At least that's how I hope that a lot of people get to kind of go about their day, whether they're applying it to their personal life, their diet, their relationships. I'm always A/B testing hypotheses I have how to have a better relationship with my mom and how to communicate better. So we're all scientists
Mhm.
in a microcosm, but certainly as a profession, it was certainly rewarding to being at the cutting edge of this. At the time when I started this research center in 2017, cannabis was about to be legalized in California, and being at UCLA, one of the kind of premier research institutions, not just in California as well as in the US, I decided to focus initially on cannabis being one of the first non-pharmaceutical and patentable products that we would study at my research center. So that was also very exciting, being at the cutting edge of that. The flip side of that is while the process of scientific discovery was very exciting, the process of running clinical trials in a university environment was candidly very stifling, insanely bureaucratic, slow, expensive, and in many ways unimaginative and very risk adverse. And so those were the most frustrating parts of being a scientist. When you do human research, a lot of additional things come into play as a scientist that you might not deal with if you're doing animal research or you were doing material science research or these other things. As soon as you start involving human subjects, my goodness, the amount of red tape and regulation that starts to kick in is tremendous. Now, some of it makes sense. You want to protect people's safety, but other parts of it are clearly standing in the way of innovation. And so that's when kind of my path as an academic scientist was coming to an end after about 3 years. And I decided it was time to really go and, I've been an intrapreneur at UCLA building this research center. And now it was time to really jump in and be an entrepreneur of a kind of a for-profit entity, fully independent, agile, able to do things on its own.
Yeah, fascinating story. Thanks for sharing. And I can definitely relate to you when you say that the health industry has so many angles and so many things to do and to fix that I also feel compelled to help and to contribute in this way. All right, so moving on, let's talk about Radical Science. Can you tell us a little bit about the company? Maybe you can provide a brief overview, and share your origin story. That would be amazing.
Sure. So in the process of building this research center at UCLA, I had the blessing to become very familiar with, how clinical trials are run and where the improvements could be made and where the improvements weren't allowed or weren't possible in the university setting, for example. On the other hand, I'd also had exposure to the botanical medicine space, to cannabis, to alternative medicines, to dietary supplements, to this whole world of non-prescription, non-pharmaceutical products. And I realized that there was a tremendous opportunity to, number one, dramatically improve the process of generating clinical proof, improve it in speed, improve it in cost, improve it in diversity, to make sure that the results of the clinical proof was applicable to everyone. And then to apply it to that new way of generating clinical proof, focus it like a laser beam on all the things that don't have proof: supplements, herbs, botanicals, alternative medicines. And if these things had proof, they would become democratized medicines. They're proven to work. We know what they do. We know they're safe. And by the way, they're super affordable, and you can buy them at the grocery store without having to deal with hospitals and doctors, insurance reimbursement, and copays, and blah, 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 blah. And no one can ever take them away. No one can ever patent them and take them away. So that was kind of the spark behind Radical, which was, in order to arrive at this beautiful future of democratized medicines, we had to then make clinical proof easy. So how do you make that clinical proof easy? And that's kind of what we set out to do at Radical Science. And my co-founder in this endeavor, who I've just been so blessed to be working with, is a woman named Paylene Thorogood. She was a tech entrepreneur. She was trained as an engineer. She had a background in big data and AI. And then she became a philanthropist, funding tons and tons of medical research at universities, and also became frustrated with how slow and expensive the process were, how small the studies were how often they just studied very homogeneous people. Therefore, the results didn't apply to 99% of other people. So we kind of teamed up and created Radical. And in a nutshell, we are running virtual direct-to-consumer automated clinical trials that are enabled with a lot of AI. And we serve wellness companies. We serve dietary supplements and foods and beverages, and we allow them for 1 to 2 orders of magnitude cheaper than what it used to cost to prove what their product does, prove that it's better than placebo, and actually become a validated, trustable brand or product for consumers.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting. Congratulations, and very much needed in this space. Uh, as you know, the health industry produces an enormous amount of data. We have many different types of data, like genomic data, biometric data, phenotypic data, data from clinical trials, and so on. Uh, how do you think about the different types of data, and specifically, what data types are most useful for wellness companies and the wellness
Mm,
sector?
sure. Maybe we could talk about it maybe in buckets. So I think maybe we could start at the most kind of foundational science. Clearly, the first place to start for, especially for very scientifically oriented wellness product companies, there are less scientifically oriented wellness companies, but let's say the ones who are really rigorous. I think what they really want to understand probably is mechanism of action of their formulation. I'm going to talk about formulation because it may have many subcomponents in there. So mechanism of action, how does their product work? And then does their product truly work or not? And so mechanism of action you could get through cell and animal studies. And then if it truly works or not, and when I use the word truly, I'm generally referring to, is it better than placebo? I think that's also really critical data for them to understand, whether it's for product development purposes or they want to have that data to make a claim that the product's clinically proven, or just so that they can know that they can sleep better at night, knowing that they're selling something that isn't snake oil, right? That it's actually real. And you achieve that through a double-blind randomized placebo-controlled clinical trial of appropriate statistical power, et cetera, et cetera. That's really the scientific side. But I would say wellness products also probably really want to understand, this is more for everything from marketing purposes to messaging. How the heck is their product being used by consumers? Are they following the label instructions? Are they skipping doses? Are they doubling up on doses? And so I think there's a massive black box for most wellness companies in that they can't answer these basic questions. And then do different types of people use your product differently? Different genders, different age groups, other types of criteria. And with a better understanding of that, you may be able to change the usage instructions. You may be better to market differently to different types of people. You may also find that you are actually creating, let's say, yes, on average, your product beats placebo. Great, but no one's average. So now it's getting more granular, like in the real world, and especially in different types of people, especially with different ways of usage, how is your product impacting people differentially? Um, and then I would say then the last bucket would be related to mechanism of action and outcomes. I think you mentioned in terms of whether it's biometric or other biomarkers. I think that's more related to the mechanism of action and some of the outcomes you might observe in the clinical trial. Is it changing a self-reported outcome measure? Things like pain or mood, where you don't really have a good biomarker signal, or is it shifting an actual biomarker, your cortisol level, for example? And one final thing I want to say about that is, practically speaking, you also want to, ultimately, at the end of the day, you're selling to a consumer. You're not a pharma company trying to get this approved by the FDA or getting a doctor to agree with it. And so because of that, what a consumer, they don't really know what cortisol is. For those who don't know, it's a marker for stress. So consumers aren't necessarily looking for products that are clinically proven to reduce their cortisol. They're looking for products that are clinically proven to make them less stressed or make them feel less stressed or make them have less feelings of anxiousness or things like that. So I think simply applying what happens a lot in academia and pharma, which is they really want to, move a biomarker, for example, to make FDA approval easier, to justify an acquisition or things like that, that may not be the right lens to use with wellness products. And for certain conditions, there are no biomarkers that exist, whether it's, you know, fatigue, everything from fatigue to most mental health areas, to things like pain, et cetera. So I would say there's a plurality of things that products may want to look into, and obviously they all have different costs associated with getting this information.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I wanted to, as a follow up question, I wanted to ask you, like, why does it have to be against placebo? You know,
Mm,
in my previous life, when I used to work in the biotech biopharma world, and most of the phase 3 clinical trials were designed to test a new drug versus the standard of care, whatever that was.
mm.
So you would compare product A versus product B, not necessarily against placebo. Why is that?
It's a great question. You're right. So if there is a really strong standard of care, um, pharma companies may often want to compare their products against that, because it's not simply about getting the product FDA approved. Once it's FDA approved, you got to get doctors to prescribe it, you got to get insurance to reimburse for it. And if it's only better than placebo when there is a very, very clear gold standard top winner, you're not going to get much traction in the market. So that may be why they elect to do that more often. I would say for the wellness space, it's an evolution. And I think eventually that might become the standard. But I think the first standard is just, does it work? Is it
Mm-hmm.
better than sugar pill? And once there's dozens, hundreds, thousands of wellness products that are better than sugar pill, then is it better than this other wellness product, or is it better than these other standards? So I think you're right in that eventually that's where the bar needs to go. But right now the bar is so low that I think we just collectively need to get the products to show that they're at least better than placebo, which is certainly better than the state of evidence right now for 99% of wellness products, which is, oh, anecdotally, our customers give us 4.6 star out of 5 in terms of like how they feel and whether they like it. And in the past, that was okay. Um, but things have shifted dramatically. So, about a year and a couple months ago, the FTC came out with their strictest guidance ever on health claims on consumer products. And it was their first new guidance in a quarter century, basically saying if you're going to make a health claim, it needs to come from double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trials generally.
Yeah,
Whereas
yeah,
before, people,
yes, yes, and I want to touch about that as well
oh,
later on.
sure, sure, yeah,
Yeah,
we'll get to
absolutely.
that.
That's definitely one of my questions because I've been reading about that topic as well. Let me stop you there for 1 second, Jeff, and ask you to tell us a little bit about radical science and uh, can you explain how it works, like how
Mm,
your approach works, and and maybe you can use a case study or something that you have implemented in the past,
sure,
to show a little bit more how it works.
sure, that sounds good. So there's a couple key things that we've done, right? So clinical trials historically and to this day are mostly still done physically. They're done at a hospital, they're done at a university, they're done in the clinic. So we've taken that model and we've gone fully virtual. And so what you do is you eliminate the cost of the facilities, you eliminate all the personnel you needed on site, and most importantly, you can now bring this clinical trial to 200 million American adults versus the handful of people who are within a 5-mile driving radius to the hospital. So tremendous improvements in diversity and reach, in addition to dramatic reductions in cost. Clinical trials also, for again, historically and to this day, they're all custom and they're all bespoke. And we said, no, no, we're going to create standardized clinical trials. So we have a standardized pain study, a standardized sleep study, a standardized mood study. Not only does that offer dramatic improvements in cost and speed, you don't have to recreate the wheel every single time, you're able to actually start to have data that is more generalizable and aggregatable. And so over time, you can get better and better insights for consumers. A problem we have right now is that you may have dozens of antidepressants that are all FDA approved. They've all proven themselves against placebo, but all the studies were non-uniform. So you can't really have a more precise understanding that like women over 40 who are vegetarian are more likely to benefit from like this type of prescription drug than not, because the data was non-uniform. So that standardization ultimately allows consumers to get to a level of personalization and benefit that currently isn't really seen, even for pharmaceuticals. There's some other things that all these manual processes with clinical trials we fully automated. And so those are some of the kind of the key aspects of Radical. And so the way it works is wellness product comes to us. They uh, give us their product. They create the matching placebo. They hand that to us, and then they're done, and we take it from there. And we'll run digital recruitment. We'll have people signing up from all over the country. At this point, we've had all 50 people from all 50 US states in our trials. We've had over 40,000 Americans be volunteers in our studies. We have 20% coming from rural areas, equal men and women. We have good representation of minorities who've traditionally been excluded from trials. And so really good representation. So we now recruit people, we screen them, we make sure they're eligible, we make sure they're not having any health risks related to the product. Then we ship product. Some people get placebo, some people get the active product. Maybe it's turmeric, maybe it's a melatonin-based product, maybe it's a passion flower-based product, maybe it's functional mushrooms. And the study could be on cognition, the study could be on sleep, it can be on these different standardized health areas. And so they receive the product, they're blinded to it, but they verify the serial number on the product, so we actually know that they got the right one. And then we're collecting data from them, usage, side effects, outcomes, and all of this is automated. And at the end of the study, we don't pay them. So these 40,000 Americans who volunteered with us, they've never been paid a dime. And because it's so convenient, and because unlike a vast majority of clinical trials, we immediately unblind them, we tell them what they took, and we give them all their data back in a health report. And so compare that with your standard trial. It's cumbersome. I have to go in all the time. I got to drive there. I'm taking a scary pharma drug. I'm a guinea pig. At the end of the study, I don't get unblinded. I'm not really sure what I took, and no one gives me my data back. And instead, they give me, $100 gift card or something like that. And it's no surprise that low single-digit percentage of Americans have ever been in a clinical trial. It's just cumbersome, and it's not approachable, and it's not valuable to a lot of the participants in it, in that they're not getting their data back. There's no full transparency. They're not getting unblinded in a quick turnaround time. So we really wanted to make this valuable to them too.
So how do you get them to volunteer? That's impressive, to get so many people like volunteer to participate in these studies.
Yeah, speaking of which, I think last year alone, Radical Science had more American volunteers in our clinical trials than all investigational new drug FDA trials for pharma combined in the entire country.
Wow.
So all FDA registered pharmaceutical drug trials, we matched them cumulatively as an organization, which is kind of crazy if you think about the insane amount of CROs and hospitals and doctors involved to get those pharma trials through. How do we do it? I think ultimately it's really simple. I mean, we basically say, hey, Rodrigo, are you having some sleep difficulties? Okay. Are you interested in natural products? Oh, you are. Well, here's an opportunity for you to benefit yourself and benefit society. We're Radical Science, we're a public benefit corporation. Rather than you going to the grocery store and buying a natural sleep aid, we're going to mail you one for free. And we've actually done more safety testing and contaminant testing on it than the grocery store has. So you're actually getting something cleaner, and it's free. We'll give you tools to track your usage and outcomes. And at the end of the study, we give you all your data back. Would you like to sign up? And you're helping society understand what these natural products do and creating non-pharmaceutical alternative medicines for folks. And so, yeah, people are signing up in droves, and they're bringing their friends in, they're referring their friends. We have people signing up for repeat studies. And so if you're actively in a clinical trial, we don't allow you to be in other Radical trials. But if you've finished one, then you have an opportunity to join another trial in another health area. So we might be the first organization to actually ever see participants go through different clinical trials and have access to all of that understanding of how it's shaped their health and how they've experienced that. So there's many things that we're kind of reinventing the wheel on here with our approach.
Oh, very, very interesting and very smart how you guys are doing. And the next question I was going to ask, which I don't think is relevant anymore, it's about the sample size, because typically you need to have, a certain sample size required to reach statistical significance in RCTs, in randomized controlled trials. But that can also lead to, increased costs in clinical studies. But in this case, if you're not paying any, if you're not spending too much money, recruiting people, then definitely your clinical studies are much more affordable than the alternative. Is that
Yeah,
accurate, or how would you compare the cost of doing
great,
a clinical study with Radical Science versus other companies or providers?
great question. So I'll give you an example. Well, before I dive into specifics, I think part of the reason sample size is always so obsessively focused on in clinical trials is because each participant, especially in these pharma FDA trials, each participant costs $20,000 to process, to recruit and process through the clinical trial. $20,000 to $40,000. So this is where, from a statistical power standpoint, you go as low as possible on sample size because it's so expensive, and try to still, maintain some of that statistical power to draw a conclusion. But when what if you drop that cost? What if you shave 2 zeros off that cost, or even 3 zeros? Well, then suddenly you can go really high on sample size and get more diverse data, get more confident in the results. And with a larger sample size, you can allow more heterogeneous populations in. With a very small clinical trial, that noise is too strong. So everyone's got to look the same. Everyone's got to look the same. But then that means your conclusions from the clinical trial only apply to this very narrow type of person that was allowed into the study. So the radical approach is different. Our minimum sample sizes for our studies are 500 people. And so these are approaching, somewhere between phase 2, phase 3 sized FDA pharma clinical trials. So a minimum of 500 people, and which is also about 10, 15 times larger than your typical supplement clinical trial that's been done in the past. And with that larger sample size, you can get more confident in the results. There's less chance of just random error generating a conclusion. And you allow a lot of diversity in because you're not so worried about that diversity throwing off the signal. And with that large diversity coming in, you have a better understanding of how this data not only applies to everyone, but then you get to sub-segment that group. If everyone's the same in the clinical trial, there's nothing to sub-segment on. And historically, most clinical trials were white urban men that probably looked all very similar. But with diversity, I can now, okay, let's look at a different subgroup by gender, by ethnicity, by lifestyle, all these other things, and see how the product may or may not affect them differently as well.
All right. Yeah, makes total sense, and definitely a competitive advantage for you guys at Radical. The other question that I wanted to ask you, it's about trustworthiness of clinical studies, and I kind of know the answer, but I don't have the full answer. So I'm going to ask it anyway. So how can someone determine if a clinical study is trustworthy? What do you look for, and how do you know if and I know that sometimes the responses that I've received in the past, it's about, oh yeah, it has to be peer reviewed, the third party reviewed by other and published in a prestigious magazine or a medical journal and so on. But how do you know that it's how do you know, as a non-scientific person, how do you know if a study it's really trustworthy?
Oh, yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, certainly publication doesn't hurt. And that's to say that if there was data that hadn't been peer-reviewed published, obviously there's a much higher level of skepticism about it because it could have just been totally fabricated and you have no idea. So I would say that's the minimum bar is, yes, peer-reviewed published, great, that's the minimum. Also recognizing that there are certain these so-called predatory journals that will or like they kind of relate to the concept of paper mills. They'll just take your paper because they're making money and you pay to have it published and all this stuff. But yes, generally, let's start there. Peer review publication, that's the most base case. I would say then the next layer up, for especially for a consumer trying to evaluate a wellness product, for example, right, or a non-prescription, a vitamin, a supplement, a wellness product, it's really important that you look at the study design. And those things that I mentioned are kind of the key variables that really help you understand that the product is truly effective. So, first off, were the people in the study blinded? Because if you knew you were getting the product, you're going to respond very differently and have biases and have an expectancy of what the product's going to do. And so your results could be thrown off. So, number one, were the people in the study blinded? Number two, did they receive either a control intervention, oftentimes placebo, or did they receive the product? That way you have something to compare to. It's not just that did people on the product feel better? It's did they feel better compared to the placebo group? Because again, all of us, if I just gave you some sugar pill and I said, hey, it's going to help you, you'll feel a little better. So that's why that placebo control is important. And then the third kind of key pillar is randomization. Because if the first 100 people to sign up for the study, I gave them the turmeric, the next 100 people that sign up, I gave them placebo. But the problem was there was a tour group that walked by my clinic, and they were the first 100 people I recruited, and it was like a Oktoberfest tour group. Those people are going to look very different than the next 100 people I recruit, which are a bunch of like college kids on, whatever, or like whatever. So I think that randomization is important as well. And the beauty of randomization is that there's so many factors that could influence someone's response to an intervention, whether it's a pharma product or wellness product, their DNA, their diet, their lifestyle. But with randomization, those factors are kind of evenly distributed between the people that got the placebo and the people that got the other product. And so they kind of cancel each other out. And therefore, any differences that emerge between the placebo and the active product is due to the products themselves and not some underlying, they're called confounding factor. So just to summarize, as a consumer, look at the clinical trial. Was it peer review published? That's the bare minimum to start. Next up, was there blinding? Next up, was there placebo control? Next up, was there randomization? And then I guess the very final thing, if all that's in place, then you actually see, was there statistical significance between the placebo and the active product? And that's the final thing, because oftentimes what you might see in these reports is the product had greater improvement than the placebo, right? I'm making up numbers here. On the product, they had a 11% improvement in sleep. Amazing. On the placebo, they had a 10.8% improvement in sleep. Therefore, so it's not just about did the products perform each other absolutely, was the difference statistically significant? Because ultimately, clinical trials are just an approximation of the truth. So, 10.8, 11, that's probably just due to just random variation and random error. They're probably no different. But if one had a 30% improvement and the other only had a 7% improvement, that is almost certainly statistically significant, especially if there is a decent sample size. So usually if you read the conclusion in the paper, it'll also talk about statistical significance as well. And then I guess the very, very, very last thing I'll say is the major media outlets, they have editorial and journalistic standards where they will generally only report on trial data that was published and from a reputable journal. And so I would say that generally, do take a look at the trial data yourself. But in the absence of that, if it's a respectable media outlet, they're trained to only talk about results that meet certain threshold of quality. And so worst case, that can always be some easy gut check for you as well.
Great answer. Thank you so much for that. So for me, the takeaway is like third party, peer reviewed journal helps a lot. Study design, statistical significance. Look for the p value as well. All of that. Thank you for that, Jeff. Now, I would like to switch gears a little bit and talk about consumer behavior. And the question I want to ask you is, like, in your opinion, like, what drives consumer behavior and trust in wellness products? some say, you must have hard scientific evidence. Some other people say, hey, so you need celebrity endorsements. Some
Hmm.
other people say you need social validation from, like, such as testimonials or customer reviews, or perhaps all of the above. So I have my theories, and I have some experience in that, but I would love to get your take on that.
Sure. I would say it's certainly changing. And I would say it certainly differs by brand. So I think, are you are you a are you a wellness brand that is a lot about like trends and like lifestyle? Your audience in general may care less about the science than a brand that is very medically oriented, very scientifically focused. But what that also means is if that could also mean that your target market that you're selling to is kind of less scientifically focused, more lifestyle focused, more trendy brand is also means your customers might be more fickle. And if they're not that discerning when deciding to go with you, the next Instagram ad pops up for the next trendy lifestyle wellness brand and they're gone and you've lost them. Versus if you capture a more kind of discerning, scientifically focused consumer, once they've done their diligence, oh, they're going to stick with you because they're not that easily swayed by other things. So I think, it really depends on your customer. But
Yeah.
trends wise, one thing that's really interesting, and this was a McKinsey report that came out 2 weeks ago, they are showed that a key trend that is very unique is that consumers are, for the first time, their number one priority when selecting a wellness product now is the scientific backing and and clinical evidence and clinically proven products. It's a new trend, and it by far trumped whether the product was natural, whether it was clean, whether it was organic, et cetera, et cetera. And so, for those who are interested in digging further into this, it's a free report. You can pull it up on McKinsey. It's basically their kind of the future state of where the wellness industry is headed. And so that is a massive, massive shift that has happened. And another part of that trend, which was interesting, was consumers are actually increasingly turning to their doctors to understand what wellness products to buy, maybe in ways that they haven't before. And maybe because it's so confusing, I am assaulted by social media ads and radio ads for all these wellness products that I'm actually going back to something simple, which is, hey doc, I trust you. You know science. What's legit or not? And then if you're in the shoes of a doctor, you're only going to recommend products where the same way you recommend pharma products. I've seen the double-blind randomized placebo-controlled data, and I know that this is safe and effective. And I'll tell you about this brand, or I'll tell you about this vitamin, or I'll tell you about this product. So to answer your question, in summary, I would say on a per consumer level, it really depends on the type of brand you have and the types of buying reasons that your specific target clientele has. But the broad sweeping trends that you're seeing are that everything is moving towards scientific evidence and clinical proof being the number one deciding factor. And then, yes, have both. So have your influencer tout your product, but man, now your influencer gets to say, go buy XYZ. It's a real product, it's clinically proven. That's why I even endorse it. And in fact, what's interesting about um, these with this new kind of FTC guidance, and we'll dig more into that later, your influencer is an extension of your advertising. So if they push the boundaries and try to insinuate that your product has scientific evidence when it doesn't, they themselves are liable for being part of committing consumer fraud. They are an extension of your marketing. And so we've been approached by some of the major talent agencies in Hollywood being like, hey, we don't know, there's shifts happening and we're trying to work with our talent and be very discerning about the types of wellness products they work with because we don't want our talent being pulled into class action lawsuits and for fraud and all these things.
Yeah, no, great answer, and yeah, definitely a trend, and but also very good point about the audience. I think that your audience determines very much kind of your go-to-market strategy as well. But definitely, it's a trend, and I think that the majority of wellness products are going to be kind of going down that route
Mm,
as well. So let me ask you about the stakeholder perspective a little bit. And one question that I have in my mind is like, who really cares about clinical proof?
mm,
If you think about the different stakeholders in the industry, you have consumers or consumers slash patients. In the case of the wellness sector, it's consumers. You have doctors, you have payers, you have investors, you have the FDA. So how would you kind of explain that? Like, who really cares,
sure.
and to whom it's really important to have clinical proof? Because I would imagine that it's not the same for every stakeholder.
Right. Well, I think, let's just say if clinical proof cost a penny, everyone would want it. Everyone would have it because it's good for business. It's
Absolutely.
good
Yeah.
it's good for the brand, it's good for the investors, it's good for the retailers. They'll sell more stuff and they'll have better repeat purchasing because the thing will work and all these things. But you're right, they're motivated by different things. Obviously, for the brand, having that clinical proof allows them to make clinically proven claims. It allows them maybe to raise money at a higher valuation, get acquired, et cetera, et cetera. For the retailer, I think for them, seeing that proof is actually kind of related to what I said earlier about the influencer thing. The retailer is also an extension. They're involved in the quote unquote, as the Federal Trade Commission defines it, they're involved in the sale and promotion of your product. They are also liable for potentially fraudulent statements or fraudulent implied statements. You don't even have to actually say something to actually make a claim. You could imply it, and you're just as liable for that. So for the retail, I think it's a CYA thing, wanting to reduce liability, and also it's a brand image thing. If a big class action lawsuit for fraud does happen to a product that was carried very prominently on some retailer shelves, that also blowback, in addition to actual financial risk for the retail, it's also blowback on their brand. And I'm so curious which retailer is going to step up and say we're the first we're the leader in proven wellness, right? I haven't seen a single retailer or e-tailer step up and do that. I think there's a massive opportunity. Shop at blank, shop proven wellness. And they just do such an extreme job of making sure that every product on their shelves is clinically proven. That's an interesting white space. Then you look at stakeholders like, yes, the investors. Obviously, if you're an investor, um, you want to be just for the sake of your own investment, also to sleep better at night. You want to back something that you know isn't just based off of placebo effects or trends because they're not enduring. And it may explain why you see so many wellness products are they just kind of be like fads. Like they have explosive growth and then they churn like crazy and they can't hold on to their consumers. Part of it, you could just say all things are trendy and brands are trendy, or you could say, oh, well, the placebo effect wears off. And after a few months of repeat buying a few times, the placebo effect wears off and that's when you churn. And so it's good for business as well. From the regulatory side, the FDA doesn't really, as long as you don't make disease claims and you don't have like poison in there and contaminants, the FDA is kind of like hands off. It's really the realm of Federal Trade Commission. And they would also love a universe where clients could easily get the proof that they need so that the FTC doesn't always have to be playing whack-a-mole when because proof is what used to be so hard and expensive to get, people have to stretch their marketing claims without the science, and the FTC has to get involved. Or litigators have to now get involved and start with these lawsuits and things. And then ultimately, why does a consumer care? You're spending your time and money and your body exposing it to something. Wouldn't you love for it to be safe? Wouldn't you love for it to be known to work? And even if you're getting the placebo effect, okay, you'll get some benefit, but number one, it wears off. And number two, there's an opportunity cost. There was some other product out there that you could have been taking and getting much more benefit than just placebo. So for consumers, ultimately, that's kind of how they might think about it as well.
Yes, yes. Thank you for that answer. And so, if I understand it correctly, the it's not FDA or FTC requirements. It's FDA or FTC, or more specifically FTC guidelines to be able to conduct clinical studies in wellness products, and you talked about double-blind, randomized controlled trials, placebo-controlled, all of those requirements, is is it a is are these rules, or is it, or are
Mm,
they guidelines that you have to follow, or how would you describe
sure.
the
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say, right, there's kind of the laws laid out by these regulators, and it's like, as a supplement, you can't make disease claims and you can't have, contaminants in there beyond XYZ amounts and things like that. And then when it comes to if you want to make a health claim, then yes, you're now really in the realm of the Federal Trade Commission. And it is law that you can't mislead consumers and that all claims have to be truthful and non-misleading and substantiated. I think where the guidance piece kicks in is how do you define adequate evidence and adequate substantiation of a claim? And that is what has shifted recently with this new guidance that came out about 12, 13 months ago. First new guidance in 25 years, and if the most explicit and strict the FTC has been, basically saying, yeah, you need double-blind randomized placebo-controlled data in a representative population. So a study I did in men in India may not be representative if I'm making claims to an American population of men and women or people of different ages and different ethnicities, for example. So the population has to be representative in my study, and it has to be statistically significant, and et cetera, et cetera. So that that part is guidance. It's not codified in a congressional bill or anything, but the FTC does have the authority to guide or to define things. That's kind of how our legislative system works. You have laws that are created, and then it's the regulators who get to like define things and stuff like that. Now, there are some people in the supplement industry who have said that the FTC has gone too far in promulgating this new guidance. So we'll see where it actually ends up landing. But if you really think about it, as a consumer, for the sake of consumers, is it that much to ask that if you're making money, profiting off of giving something to someone, is it too much to ask that you have some proof that the thing that you're charging them $30 for works better than a 1 penny sugar pill? Is it that crazy to ask that? And it's like,
definitely not.
and it's like if you were to buy something for your family member, isn't like that's kind of what you would want for your family member.
Yeah.
Sometimes people are not as self-loving, so sometimes I frame the question rather than what you want for yourself. What would you want for your loved one? Oh shit, I'd want to give them something that isn't better than just an empty capsule with cornstarch in it. I want something that's real, beyond placebo.
Yeah. No, thank you. I have another question about the economic implications of running clinical studies. And if you let me ask you a hypothetical question, but if you are the owner or the CEO of a wellness company, and you have multiple products in your portfolio, uh, and you have limited budget, right? But you're convinced that it makes total sense to invest in clinical studies. But you cannot run clinical studies for your 10 or 50 or 20 products that you may have, to sell. So how would you go about deciding like how to invest in clinical studies? And the second part of that question is, have you seen any evidence of business impact or business uplift
Mm,
from companies that actually invested in clinical trials and clinical studies?
sure. So I think first off, you're right that a lot of these wellness companies have tremendous amounts of, some of them have many, many SKUs, but just knowing Pareto's principle and how it kicks in, it's probably a handful of those SKUs that are generating 70, 80+% of the revenue or the financial impact. You kind of see that with all systems. Um, and so it could be that just focus on those SKUs. And what you might find is those handful of SKUs, especially once they're clinically proven, now go from taking 70, 80% of the makeup of your finances to now it's 90+%, right? And they're just that much more impactful. But also there's a halo effect. So no one expects a brand in the next 30 days to suddenly have every single SKU clinically proven. But think about the halo effect you could have if even a few of your SKUs, or even just one to start, is clinically proven. I think consumers naturally, your advertising, even though it's talking about that one SKU, consumers start to say, oh, well, that's a brand that in general is science backed and in general has clinical proof, even if it's only on a subset of their SKUs. And obviously, again, it makes sense to start with your hero products, um, because those can just amplify that much further. And speaking of the amplification, we've seen both kind of theoretical as well as real world implications of this. And so if you look at kind of the consumer psychology landscape, when products make the claim that they're clinically proven versus saying just like support sleep, right? Support sleep is kind of weaker claim versus clinically proven to improve your sleep, for example. When you compare statements like that, you find at least a 20% lift in willingness to pay from consumers, and you see a doubling of high purchase intent. So that can be pretty powerful. And what wasn't studied in those studies, which will also be interesting, is also does retention and repeat purchase go up? That's just about initial impression, initial purchase. But man, if you're taking something and you trust that it's clinically proven, you're much less likely to churn. You're much less likely to switch to another product. Now, that's kind of the theoretical academic research that's out there. In terms of the real world case studies from our clients, for example, we've seen our clients, because they're now clinically proven, we've seen them been able to, and they've got the peer reviewed paper, we've seen them being able to leverage it for PR and earned media, getting mainstream media outlets to talk about their products in ways that you could not if you didn't have that proof. We've seen it lift up sales. We've seen them increase their pricing. We've seen certain ones who go after they knew this was a strategy of theirs to grow their supplement line, was to get doctors to talk about it. The doctor being able to have their salespeople go in and get tremendous acknowledgement from the doctors, because the doctor's like, wait, you're showing me a 400-person double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trial that was published. Like, I only see this with pharma products. You're the first supplement product I've ever heard of in my life that like has hit this benchmark. So now instead of, when patients ask me about supplements, instead of saying, I don't know anything about that, I can't tell you anything, be like, well, at least here's a couple products that I've learned about and the data checks out. I've looked at it. So I've seen them penetrate the healthcare practitioner channel very effectively. All the way to, again, earlier we talked about influencers, getting certain influencers to invest in their company and then become spokespeople. Because as an influencer, I'm very protected. I mean, what is my one key asset as an influencer? It's my credibility, it's my brand, it's my public nature. So to back a wellness company that one day may turn out to be snake oil, no better than placebo, that could be very damaging for an influencer, both for their reputation as well as actual consumer fraud lawsuits. So I think it's kind of all of the above. Different ways that these companies have used the data differently.
Absolutely, absolutely. Jeff, I have two more questions. Two more questions before we go. The first one is about health data and privacy and data privacy. Like, what, if you're a wellness company, what are the things that you have to keep in mind, to make sure that you're managing, your health data and privacy, from clinical studies in the right way, to make sure that you don't make any you don't get in trouble, essentially.
Sure.
So any tips that you can provide?
Oh gosh, it's a great question, and I think also depending on, as a brand, if you currently or have aspirations to sell to other geographies too, and in particular, say Europe, where their data privacy laws are much stricter, say than in America, it may make sense for you to adopt SOPs that already kind of meet the requirements of other geographies, so that as you enter those other areas, you don't have to dramatically change what you're already doing. So something to look at as you're thinking about international expansion. But I think there's things you can do that you can control. There's things that you can't control. So for things you can't control, you can't control hacks. So it's just make sure your security systems are up to snuff. Make sure you do penetration testing. Make sure you hire outside firms to audit, and also, again, attempt to penetrate and hack you. And that's the only way you're going to find the weaknesses in your system. It's happening to everyone. It's happening to people who have the most seemingly secure data sets. And those breaches not only cost massive amounts of headache and financial cost, it really can damage brand reputation. I mean, look what happened recently with 23andMe, which already people were a little wary about in terms of like, what are you doing with my data? And then they had this big hack that happened recently. So really damaging on that regard. But with
Yeah.
proper internal, external resources, it's something that hopefully, even though you can't control it, it's something you can minimize the outcomes. Now, in terms of what you can control, I think it's in terms of what you actually do with the data. And there are things that are not necessarily illegal, but may not be necessarily ethical to do with the data. And that's where it probably just comes down to transparency, full transparency. Like when you're collecting data from your customers, like tell them exactly what you will and won't do with it. And that transparency can go a really long way. And then, like stick to those obligations and promises that you made. So again, I think to kind of summarize all this, there's protecting yourself as best as you can against bad actors and hackers. Then it's making sure that you obviously comply with all laws that your product currently is subject to, as well as any planned expansion geographies, complying with those laws. And then just like being ethical and transparent, even if it's not required by law, that can go so long. And ultimately, you think about the brand and credibility that you have, especially in the wellness sector, that is so precious. You're not competing on patents. You're not competing on, I have this FDA approved thing and you don't. Ultimately, for a lot of these wellness products, brand and reputation and perception is one of the main reasons that differentiate between these wellness products.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And thank you. So, Jeff, my final question. This is going to be a slightly more personal question, and
Okay.
then with this, we're gonna wrap up. So the question is like, what one wellness product can someone build for you that you would definitely buy?
Oh, interesting. Oof. Okay, so right now, if I think about all the things that I want to do to optimize my longevity and health span, right? Supplements are a relatively easy thing for me to purchase and self-administer. Great. But some of the other longevity things that are more difficult for me to do, but I believe has a measurable impact on my health and longevity. There's a couple buckets. One would be maybe more accessible ways for me to do like cold exposure. And I think people are just coming out with products now. I believe there's a product where I could like fill a bathtub and I drop a device in it and it'll cool the entire bathtub down. Because to buy a cold plunge requires a lot of extra space and a lot of extra costs. That could be an interesting area. If that product doesn't already exist, I hope someone builds it, but I think I've heard about some stuff like that. Another product that it's a little out there, I'm not going to lie, it's a little out there, but I have been donating plasma a lot because, yes, it helps other people. Yes, that plasma can be used for other things, but I think, and this is super fringe, but I think there's some potential health benefits and very little to no harm. But it's a laborious process. I got to go to a facility, I do all this stuff. So who knows if there's some near-term future where I could have a device at home that it's almost like, imagine like a cuff that I wear on my arm, and through like sensors, it knows exactly where my vein is, and it could basically um, extract plasma. And plasma has a lot of inflammatory compounds in it. It has a lot of potentially pro-aging compounds in there. And by kind of extracting that, I force my body to recreate new, fresh plasma that may be able to help my overall health. And this is kind of related to the whole, like, why if you give old mice young mice blood, the old mice get healthier. And why if you take old mice blood and you give it to young mice, the young mice get sicker. It's not the red blood cells. It's not the platelets. It's something in the soup. It's in the plasma is what we're starting to realize. So again, super fringe, super out there, not suggesting anyone do that. More research is needed. But at least from a very, very minimal downside, because people have been donating plasma for decades. We know there's pretty minimal downside. And who knows? People are being helped by my plasma when I donate, and maybe there's some potential health benefits for me. So it's win-wins across the board.
Jeff, this was awesome. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you and talk to you soon.
Thank you, Rodrigo. It was a pleasure and honor to be part of your show, and thank you for all the insightful questions.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye now.